Welcome to the Discover Bittensor podcast. Today I want to talk about something much bigger than price, much bigger than subnets, and much bigger than crypto as a niche internet hobby. I want to talk about politics. Not party politics, not left versus right or elections, but I mean politics in the deeper sense. Who has power? Who controls the rules? Who decides what money is? Who decides which technologies get built? And who gets access to the most important infrastructure of the future? Because if you zoom out far enough, I think Bitcoin has already had a deeply political impact on the world. And I think Bittensor, if it succeeds, could one day become politically disruptive in a very different but equally important way. Bitcoin matters because it gave people a way to step outside a monetary system that governments can inflate. Bittensor matters because it may offer a way to step outside a world in which the most powerful technology on earth is developed by a tiny number of companies, under the pressure and influence of a tiny number of governments. And that's the topic today. And I want to do this carefully, not as propaganda or as a rant, and also not as a utopian fantasy. But I also don't want to undersell how profound these systems may be, because in my view, Bitcoin really was a breakthrough, and Bittensor might be too. So let's start with Bitcoin. People in wealthy Western countries sometimes struggle to understand just how important Bitcoin is, because many of us have grown up in countries where, despite all the problems, the currency usually still works well enough that we do not think about it every day. You get paid, you pay rent, you buy groceries, you keep savings in a bank account, you complain about inflation, but the entire monetary system has not collapsed underneath your feet, and you just don't think a lot about it. And you have to understand that's a very privileged position, because for billions of people around the world, bad money is not an abstract economic issue. It's a direct assault on their savings, their planning horizon, and their basic sense of stability. Look at Argentina. It was reported that annual inflation in Argentina was expected to end 2024 near 100%, after having peaked more than 200% earlier that year, or at the end of 2023. So this is crazy. Like most Western countries, we are talking about a few percent, and in Argentina it was more than 100% in 2023. Actually, many people in Argentina were described as turning to Bitcoin because inflation was running at devastating levels and foreign exchange access was restricted. Or look at Venezuela. It's been reported that Venezuelans have used crypto as a hedge against inflation and instability in the banking system, while later reporting described continuing dollar scarcity and a turn towards crypto in the private sector. And some people described Venezuelans as early adopters of crypto because hyperinflation and instability under the Maduro regime. And this is where Bitcoin becomes much easier to understand. Imagine you live in a place where the money in your bank accounts melts away not over 30 years, but over months. Imagine your local currency is so unstable that saving in it feels almost irrational. Imagine access to dollars is restricted. Imagine that each year you have to think not just about earning money, but about escaping your own money, which sounds crazy to many people in the West. And in that world, Bitcoin stops looking like a weird speculative asset. It starts looking like a lifeboat. Not a perfect lifeboat, it's volatile, it has friction and it has risks. But for many people, it has still been better than simply sitting inside a currency that's being destroyed. And that's why Bitcoin is revolutionary. Because for the first time in history, an ordinary person with an internet connection could hold a scarce digital asset that no local government could print more of, no central bank could debase, and no politician could quietly dilute to solve this year's budget problem. And this is not a small thing, okay? This, in my opinion, is a civilizationally important thing. And now, for a Western audience, it's very easy to hear those examples and think, yes, okay, that sounds important for Argentina or Venezuela, but I live in Europe or the United States or somewhere more stable. And that's exactly why Bitcoin is easy to underestimate. Because if your own money still mostly functions, you can afford to treat monetary decay as a theory. However, the problem is also that most people just don't see it. Like, the purchasing power of the US dollar has basically collapsed 80 or 85% over the last 50 years or so. And most people are not aware of this at all. It's pretty insane, actually, if you look at the numbers. So I invite all of you to have a look at these numbers, to see them with your own eyes for both the dollar and the euro. It's pretty crazy, even the last couple of years. And Bitcoin matters even in the West for two reasons. First, it exposes the fact that state money is not sacred. It's a design choice backed by institutions, incentives, and political power. Second, it creates an exit. And exits matter. Institutions behave differently when people have no alternative, and they behave differently when, even imperfectly, people do. That's why major institutions like the IMF and BIS discuss crypto in terms of monetary sovereignty, capital controls, and the state's grip on the monetary system. They are not treating this as a toy, they are treating it as something that can weaken the monopoly claims of national monetary systems. So when people say Bitcoin is just a speculative bubble, or just digital gold, or just internet money, I think they are often missing the deeper point. Bitcoin is political because money is political. Bitcoin matters because it gave people a way to preserve capital outside systems that can be abused. And once that becomes possible, the world changes. Maybe not overnight, but structurally it does. Now, Bitcoin's breakthrough was enormous, but it still has a limitation. Bitcoin is incredible at helping people store value. It's much less directly about organizing production. Bitcoin protects savings. Bitcoin protects scarcity. Bitcoin gives people a monetary escape hatch. But it doesn't really answer the next question. How should useful work be organized? How should intelligence be funded? How should compute be allocated? How should open markets compete with closed corporate systems in the production of the technologies that are starting to shape the future? And that's exactly where Bittensor becomes interesting. Because Bittensor is not mainly trying to solve money, it's trying to solve the organization of useful digital work. And it's often described as an open source platform made up of subnets, where miners produce digital commodities and validators evaluate them. Those commodities can include things like AI inference, storage, compute, prediction, and other forms of machine produced value. And that's a very different ambition from Bitcoin. Bitcoin gave us decentralized money. Bittensor is trying to give us decentralized production markets. And if that works, the political implications could be enormous. Because we are entering a world where the most powerful technology on earth may be advanced AI. And that alone is a political fact. And yet the frontier of that technology is currently concentrated in a very small number of hands. Anthropic, OpenAI, and Google controlled almost 90% of the enterprise market by the end of 2025 for large language models. So already, before we even get to Bittensor, we are in a very strange situation. A handful of companies are building the strongest tools humanity has ever built, and those companies operate under the influence, pressure, and strategic interest of a handful of governments, mostly the US actually. And it's not a conspiracy theory, it's just what concentrated power looks like. And the recent Anthropic case shows how political this can get. Reuters reported that the Pentagon tried to designate Anthropic as a supply chain risk after the company refused to remove guardrails that would have allowed its systems to be used for autonomous weapons or domestic surveillance. And a federal judge temporarily blocked that blacklisting. Reuters also reported that the Pentagon has been pushing top AI firms, including Anthropic and OpenAI, to make their tools available on classified networks with fewer restrictions. Just stop there for a moment and think about it. A small number of companies built frontier AI, which is already being used by the US government and by the US Army, for example, recently in Iran. And governments then pressure these companies on military use, surveillance, deployment restrictions, and national strategy. And we are somehow supposed to treat this as normal. And to me, that's the real political backdrop against which Bittensor matters. Because Bittensor offers a radically different possibility. Instead of saying that frontier digital intelligence must be built inside a small corporate circle, Bittensor says useful digital work can be produced in open competitive markets. Instead of closed internal hierarchies, it uses subnets. Instead of executive decisions on who gets rewarded, it uses incentive mechanisms. Instead of a few firms owning the whole stack, it allows many subnet economies to emerge under a shared token system. And because Bittensor is open source and decentralized, it's much harder for any one government to simply shut the whole thing down. Could a government ban mining or validation in its own jurisdiction? Yes, of course. Could it make life difficult for companies interacting with it? Yes. Could it pressure local participants? Yes. But that's very different from being able to turn the system off globally. That's one of the key political features of decentralization. Look at Bitcoin. Reuters reported in late 2025 that mining had rebounded despite the 2021 nationwide ban in China. And in February 2026, China again tightened its broader crypto crackdown and reaffirmed that crypto related activities remain illegal. And yet, Bitcoin is still there because it's decentralized and people can just do it elsewhere in countries where it is allowed. With Bittensor, we might see the same thing. Or, in the case of China, we might actually not see a ban because actually China is really into open source AI models in contrast to the US, which is very interesting. So who knows? Maybe they are much more open-minded to Bittensor. Let's see. Anyway, back to my point about decentralization. It basically weakens the assumption that power can always be exercised from one center outward. And it matters even more when the thing being decentralized is not just money, but the production of intelligence itself. And think about how governments normally regulate powerful technologies. They pressure companies, they pressure data centers, they pressure payment rails, they pressure app stores, contractors, hosting providers, and boards of directors. And that works very well when the core unit of an organization is a company. But Bittensor is not just one company. It's a network of subnet economies. The code is open source, the platform is documented as open source, and the system is built around distributed miners and validators rather than one corporate headquarters. So yes, a government can attack the edges, but the core is much harder to kill. And that's exactly why this could become political. Because if some future subnet becomes really useful and disruptive, governments may discover that what worked against ordinary companies doesn't work nearly as cleanly against decentralized production markets. And that's when things get really interesting. There's another layer here that people often miss. Bittensor is not just decentralized in the technical sense. It's also decentralized in an ownership and incentive sense. Tau has a hard cap of 21 million, and subnet alpha tokens are also capped at 21 million each, according to the white paper. In other words, these subnet economies do not work like traditional companies that can simply keep printing more shares forever and diluting its shareholders. This is something that most people also are not aware of. But if, for example, you hold shares of, I don't know, Amazon or name any big company, once in a while, they just create new shares and they basically dilute your shares. And it's basically crazy. You don't notice it, but it happens. Very much so, actually. And this matters politically too, because one of the most common stories in the normal world is this. A company becomes successful, then more insiders capture more upside, then more shares get issued, then ownership is diluted, then access stays narrow. And Bittensor is obviously not free from power dynamics, but its token structure does create a very different starting point. A subnet can't just decide to infinitely print more ownership claims, the way many traditional systems can effectively dilute people over time. So when people say Bittensor is just another crypto project, I think they often miss how unusual this is. It's really an attempt to create scarce, open, competitive digital commodity markets where the rules are much more visible and much harder to centrally rewrite. Now, the boldest version of the Bittensor thesis is not just that it could decentralize AI, it's that it could become a template for decentralizing the production of many kinds of digital infrastructures. If a subnet can coordinate compute, storage, inference in a transparent market, then over time you start asking bigger questions. Why must every useful digital service be produced by a closed firm? Why must the future of intelligence be owned by a few companies? Why should access to the strongest tools on earth depend on the values of few executives and the pressure of a few states? And that's where Bittensor becomes really politically relevant. Not because it runs for office, but because it quietly proposes a different answer to where important systems should come from. So, if I had to summarize the political impact of Bitcoin and Bittensor as clearly as possible, I would say this. Bitcoin attacked the monopoly over money. Bittensor may attack the monopoly over intelligence, production, and any digital work, actually. Bitcoin matters because it gave people, especially in unstable countries, a way to preserve capital outside collapsing fiat systems. For people in places like Argentina and Venezuela, this is actually really, really important. It can be the difference between keeping your savings and watching them disappear like almost overnight. So, Bittensor matters because it suggests that the most important technology of the coming decades does not necessarily have to be developed inside a tiny club of firms under the shadow of a tiny club of governments. And that's why I think both systems are politically important. And Bitcoin already proved that a decentralized alternative to state money can become real. Bittensor may prove that a decentralized alternative to closed AI production can become real too. And if it does, that would be one of the most consequential political developments of our time. So, no, I don't think Bitcoin and Bittensor are just about price. And no, I don't think they are just a niche crypto story either. Bitcoin was a real breakthrough because it gave people a way to preserve capital outside of inflationary political systems. Bittensor may become a breakthrough because it gives the world a way to build and fund useful intelligence outside a close alliance of giant firms and state power. And this is very, very powerful. And I think most people haven't even considered this. Even most people I talk to in the West, they are not they don't really understand how politically important Bitcoin is and has been actually, because here in the West, many people just don't pay attention. They don't know how unfair the world is actually, and especially access to finances, access to money, and how just a few people basically who control a state, a government, or a central bank can have a very important impact on the life of millions or even billions of people, which is very, very strange actually when you think about it. I'll stop there and just think about this for a while. I don't know, like if you guys who listen to me, if you think about this a lot, but think about it. It's it really has the potential to be very, very big. So yeah, we'll see how it develops over time. But as I said before, I think most people who look into Bittensor might not even be aware of this. So yeah. So thank you for listening to this podcast. And if you want more information also about this political aspect and also the comparison of Bitcoin and Bittensor, you can have a look at my website, discoverbittensor.com. Thanks a lot. Bye bye.